Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Budget Magic. So I'm super excited this week. We're heading to Standard to play a deck built around a card I've been trying to get work for a while. So if there's one card I've gotten requests for more than any other card that we haven't played yet in Standard, it's Hapatra, Vizier of Poisons. And I've been waiting and tweaking and trying to get this deck to a place where it's good enough for us to play on videos. And I think I finally got there. It took quite a few rebuilds, changing quite a few things, but I think we finally got to the point where we can play a -1/-1 themed Hapatra deck in Standard, so I'm super excited. I'm calling this one CrocPatra because Hapatra, Crocodiles, put it together, CrocPatra, you know. Anyway, as you can see, 83 bucks in the paper world, 25 ticks on Magic Online, so a pretty sweet price for a really unique and fun deck. Anyway, a quick reminder before we break down CrocPatra for Standard. If you enjoy this deck and you enjoy Budget Magic in general, it would be amazing of you if you could take a quick second, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So first off, we got to talk about Hapatra herself. So Hapatra, the namesake card, legendary 2-drop, and it really likes -1/-1 counters to go on things. So while Hapatra theoretically can put counters on things herself, if it gets in combat damage, we put a counter on something. That doesn't happen all that often because it's only a 2/2, hard to get in combat damage with it, but every once in a while it happens. The big deal though is the second ability, where whenever we put a counter on something, a -1/-1 counter, we get a 1/1 snake with death touch, which is super sweet. Not only is it a token for chump blocking, but the fact it has death touch means it can trade up for a lot of really big things. So if we can get a Hapatra out, we just want to start putting counters on things and building this army of death touch snakes. We can attack with them easily because they're really impossible to chump because they're going to kill anything because of death touch. They block well to keep us alive. So Hapatra is kind of the focus of our deck. You might be wondering, why are we playing Hapatra as a 4-of, even though it's legendary? A lot of times you want to play 3 legendaries so you don't get clucky draws. And the answer is basically, Hapatra dies a lot. As a 2-mana 2/2, it dies to Shock, it dies to a Braid, it dies to Fatal Push, you name it, it dies to it. So having 4 of them in our deck is actually fine, because we really want to have an Hapatra on the battlefield. And it's going to die often, so if we draw more than one, we just wait for the first one to die, play another Hapatra, and go from there. So Hapatra is part of our -1/-1 counter payoff package. It's highlighted by Hapatra, one of the namesake cards. We also have Nest of Scarabs, which is sort of like a Hapatra enchantment. So when I first read Nest of Scarabs, I thought it was literally a Hapatra enchantment, where whenever we put a counter on something, we get a 1/1 black snake. However, that's not quite right. There is one super key difference that makes Nest of Scarabs really insane. Hapatra, no matter how many counters we put on something, only makes 1 death touch snake. Nest of Scarabs, on the other hand, makes an insect, not death touch, but an insect, a 1/1, for every counter we put on something. So if we put 3 counters on something, we get 3 1/1s for free, just for having Nest of Scarabs on the battlefield, and they do stack, so if you have 2 Nest of Scarabs, 3 counters is 6 tokens. Basically, Nest of Scarabs is insane in this deck, and lets us go super, super wide. Our next payoff for -1/-1 counters is Obelisk Spider, which is a little bit different. Instead of making a bunch of tokens, Obelisk Spider drains our opponent for 1 whenever a counter goes on something. It's like Hapatra, so only 1 drain no matter how many counters we put on something. The nice thing is, it's also a really good blocker. In a world of ramen on bread where there's tons of 2/1s attacking, Obelisk Spider blocks really well. It dodges a lot of the red removal. A Braid doesn't get it, Magma Spray, Shock doesn't get it, Incendiary Flow doesn't get it, so it's very good in that matchup and pretty reasonable in other matchups as well. The other sweet upside of the Spider is it kind of deals 2 damage to something because it puts a counter on it and deals the damage when it blocks it. So it can kill 2 toughness creatures by itself, plus that counter sticks around, so it's a way we can slowly eat through bigger creatures. And if our opponent attacks into it, we can always just chump with it, get a counter on something, trigger our Nest of Scarabs, trigger our Hapatra, start making a bunch of tokens. So very sweet there. Our last payoff is also our biggest payoff, the Scorpion God. So the red-black god, it's really big, a 6/5 for 5, really hard to kill, and it also really interacts well with -1/-1 counters because it draws us a bunch of cards whenever a creature with a -1/-1 counter dies, plus we can use it to dump counters on things, so in the late game, maybe we don't got much going on, we don't have much action, we can just put counters on things with the Scorpion God, trigger our Hapatra, trigger our Nest of Scarabs, trigger our Obelisk Spider, maybe even kill some stuff to draw some cards, find more action, keep going. So it's kind of our big payoff to close off long games. So these are the payoffs for putting -1 counters on things. Next, we got to look at how we put counters on things, and this is where we get to the Crocs. First off, we have Channeler Initiate, which is really absurd in this deck. So there's two things awesome about Channeler Initiate. First off, like any deck, it helps us ramp into our more expensive stuff. We can play our Scorpion God a bit quicker, etc., by being a mana dork. The other thing is, it puts 3 counters on something, often itself, but it can put it on something else, which means if we get a Nest of Scarabs out, just playing a Channeler Initiate is going to get us 3 1/1s. If we have a Hapatra, we get a token for that too. So for 2 mana, we often end up with like 3 or 4 tokens, maybe draining our opponent with our Obelisk Spider, so it's really, really good in this deck. Amonkhet Eternal is a little bit slower, Crocodile number 1 I should say, but it's really sweet because it continually triggers. Every time our opponent casts a spell, we put a -1 counter on it. That's meant to be a drawback for the most part, but in our deck that's actually an upside. Let's say we got Hapatra out, we got a Nest of Scarabs. Every time our opponent casts a spell, a creature, whatever spell they want to cast, we're getting a bunch of tokens for putting a counter on our Amonkhet Eternal. Then we might be able to even get in combat damage because it's pretty big, remove all the counters, keep it going. So Amonkhet Eternal is like this really slow way. It's almost like the Bitter Blossom of our deck, where every turn we're getting a token, we're getting 2 tokens, and just slowly filling up our board. Finally, we have Crocodile the Crossing. Might look a little bit underpowered, but it's actually pretty strong. We can use it to dump the -1 counter on like a Channeler Initiate to keep making mana with it, to trigger all of our stuff, and it's a 5/4 haste for 4, which lets us steal games out of nowhere. It gets in a ton of damage. I mean, if you think about it, those are the stats that we see on Hazaret, which is proven to be one of the most powerful cards in the Ramanap Red deck. Crocodile the Crossing is kind of our Hazaret. It's not indestructible, but it doesn't have the drawback of having only 1 card in hand, so we can just get in there for a ton of damage out of nowhere with Crocodile the Crossing. We also have Grind to Dust as kind of our final -1 counter thing. It's a little slow, but it's a removal spell that also puts counters on things. We get 2 counters split up between 2 creatures, which means we're triggering our Nest of Scarabs, we're triggering Hapatra, all that stuff. The other sweet thing is our deck puts a lot of counters on things. Our Spider puts counters on things. Hapatra puts counters on things. Grind to Dust puts counter on things. The Scorpion God puts counter on things. So in the late game, we can usually get a bunch of counters spread out around our opponent's creatures, and then use the Dust Half to just one-sided wrath away, with Exile even, our opponent's board. And the Exile part also means it gets rid of Ronas, it gets rid of Hazaret, and all those annoying indestructible creatures that are otherwise super hard to deal with. The rest of the deck, we have a bunch of the good red removal. Harness Lightning, Abrade, Magma Spray, basically just to keep us alive against aggressive decks, to fight against Ramanap Red, Green-Black Energy, zombies, all that kind of stuff. And then we also have 4 Attune with Ether, which kind of does 2 things. It lets us cut down on our land count. I think we only have 21 lands, so we are kind of counting Attune as lands in our deck. Plus, it gives us energy for us to be able to use our Harness Lightnings. It supports our Ether Hubs, which are key to us being able to cast our spells. So it's just very, very strong in our deck. We're not a traditional energy deck. Our only real energy cards are the Harness Lightnings and our Ether Hubs, but Attune fixes our mana, lets us cut back on the lands. It's just super good. As far as the mana base, the 2 most important lands are Ether Hub and Evolving Wilds. So theoretically, we're 4 colors because we want to flashback or aftermath the white side of Grind to Dust. So being able to have white mana to do that is actually pretty important. So there we lean on Ether Hub. That's our only way of making white mana. Evolving Wilds also lets us search out whatever color of mana we need so we can cast all of our spells on time. And then a bunch of basic lands to get with our Evolving Wilds, tutor up with our Attune with Ether. As far as the sideboard, a bunch more removal, Magma Spray and Abrade to come in against aggressive decks. Nevermore and Cut Ribbons are more important for slower matchups. Getting Planeswalkers, Ribbons gives us another way to deal some damage and close out the game with the flashback. Then we have Transgress the Mind and Doomfall, mostly for control decks as ways to steal something out of our opponent's hand. Also Doomfall, another way to deal with indestructible creatures like Hazaret and so forth. Crook of Condemnation to fight against graveyard decks, the various God Pharaoh's Gift decks, the Blue-White Monument deck, all those type of decks. And that is CrocPatra for Standard. And that's our Budget Magic deck for this week. So I think this deck is really fun and it's really sweet. I don't think that it's on the upper end of the competitive scale. I think it's competitive enough. I wish there was a tiny bit more -1/-1 counter support. Like, it's good enough that I think you can take this, you can play it in leagues on Magic Online, you can take it to F&M, but I don't think it's one of the most competitive budget decks that we've had for Hour of Devastation Standard, but it's definitely one of the sweetest ones, and it's really cool to finally have a way to make Hapatra into a playable card. There's a lot of good synergy. Scorpion God is a very strong finisher. We got ways to kill our opponent, like with Obelisk Spider, without really getting in damage. We got a one-sided Wrath and Grinded Dust. Nest of Scarabs is incredibly impressive. Sometimes we just go so wide with Nest of Scarabs, so I think the deck's really sweet. I'm really excited to show it off. So anyway, let's get to the video so you can see how it works. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you haven't already, take a minute and click that subscribe button. It's a great way to support the channel for free, and you'll find the next video in the playlist right here.